Hello and welcome to Color Profiles, and when you have survived the part before about color space, then even more. A big thank you, because I think it's very important to know this stuff. And in the moment you know exactly what's all about, then it becomes pretty simple. And if you design your own color management, then you have maybe no trouble at all anymore, because once it is established and you stick with your workflow and your pipeline, then that is maybe just an ease, because it makes your life perhaps much simpler. What I want to integrate here today is, of course, the size of the color spaces, and with that the size of the profiles, because they live inside of these, and how to make a conversion between these, if at all. And of course, I want to start here pretty simple. In an ideal world, we have maybe here our camera, and in front of the camera we have an object, and we have a light source here. The light source, perhaps the sun, exactly in a specific light temperature, illuminates the object, and the camera is set up in a way that we get a signal that finally creates an image, and this image goes directly into Cinema 4D, image, Cinema 4D, and we can use it as it is. No further concerns about the whole thing here. Okay, so this is maybe a little bit too simple, but the idea when Srgb, Standard Rgb, was created was, of course, to come as close as possible to it, because it's, to my knowledge, the smallest RGB space possible when we want to have a decent image, of course. So the first trouble starts, of course, as we have seen, when the light is not exactly in the way we want, and that means we get something in the camera that is maybe different. We have to set up our camera, and given the fact that this camera finally produces an image that is relatively neutral, because the color temperature inside of the camera is set correctly or later on in the development, and the light is also in the right amount, so we don't have any crash blacks or clipped whites in the picture. If so, then HDRI, of course. So let's start here from there, because this is pretty much out of our control when we talk about color profiles, but we will see that we have a little bit to do with this, and I have introduced this, of course, before. So the camera by itself, if set up correctly, that means no sharpening inside, no saturation boost up or so, it produces maybe an image, or let's say just an information here. And this information is, of course, somehow very unique to the camera. So we need to get this into something that we can use all over the place. So we can give that to friends, to other studios, wherever, and we hope that they can see the picture as we have intended it. Of course, normally we have a little bit work on it, but we want to have, of course, the quality from the start as high as possible. So we take maybe something like the Macbeth chart into the world, and we take an image based on the light situation that we have, and this information can be then computed inside of an algorithm, and this gives me then the first profile here. And this profile is then something like a camera calibration. So we get here an information out that has already some stability. And with the profile, we can say we can go then to a standard color profile. So if that is all done and we know exactly that the camera produced something, we can say this information from the camera goes then translated into one color space. And this box here stands for the color profile, and I want to talk about three different ones, and this is Srgb for Standard Rgb, and we have mostly Adobe Rgb, and this is a very popular one. It's a little bit wider than Srgb, and I will show you that in a second, roughly. And we have Photo. And Photo is, of course, something, as the name suggests, huge. It's professional. It's really huge. And we have to talk about the size by itself, as I have said here already. So these 3 profiles can be then translated here from what we got from our camera profiling then into this profile. And this profile here finally ends up as data inside of the image. Same here, but this time we have already all the values of the image in a space, in a color space or in a color profile that can be given to any device. And if that device has the option to go with Srgb, Adobe Rgb or ProPhoto, for example, then we can expect that if that device is by itself calibrated, gives us exactly the same color. And in case of Cinema 4D, we have now human perception primarily working on it, because it goes into a texture and is read from a camera that has no idea about the real world. It's a virtual camera. So when we give this data directly to Cinema 4D and we set up the color space, and this could be gamma based or linear, of course, all of these work with gamma 1.0, which is linear, or with 2.2, for example, which is the standard today in Mac and in Windows. And so we can use this material here in Cinema 4D, and after everything is rendered, we can decide what we need finally, if we distribute this to a printing house, to a TV station, or to the cinema. And every time we have to deal then with more and more and more color profiles. But to talk about all of these export options would really expand here, because we talk about textures and not about the whole pipeline. So I say here we can have here another profile, and this is then up to the needs that we have, and you might have your experience because you produce maybe visualization that goes to print, or you create animation that goes directly to a TV station, or you go with visual effects for the movies. Whatever. The main idea here is, of course, that we have an understanding in all of that. And I take this here away for a moment, and then we go to a little bit more detail about this. I want to give you an example, and it has some limitations, of course. You might think the real world works differently. Please ignore some details in it. And let's say we have furnitures here in America, and someone else has furnitures, a model, maybe from Mies van der Rohe, for example, and someone has it in Japan and somewhere else maybe as well. So all of these 3 guys want to travel now, but they can't travel with the furniture. So they have maybe the currency dollar here, or yen, or let's say something else. Then we go to a bank, and that would be the color space. And inside of the color space, we have now here a profile, and that is the exchange rate. So we sell exactly the same object to different currencies, go to the same bank, go via a different model to something where we have agreed to that that is a value, maybe gold or something like that. And gold would be here then the currency inside of our profile. Then we travel with the gold along, because that's something that is unified and we have agreed to it. And then we go far away to a bank, again, where we have an exchange rate for this gold, and we get the currency of the country, and we are able, and please forgive me the simplification here, to get the same furniture. Oh yeah, it's a little bit bigger, this is a little bit smaller. These are details, ignore this. But this is pretty much the way we want to work. And if we have to go back, then we sell it, we lose maybe money, but these are the details that I asked you to ignore. Then we go get gold, and we go back on the road, and wherever we stay, we have maybe enough gold to get exactly the same furniture spec. This is simplified, but in a nutshell, that's all what it is about. So back to this, and I have put here some very scribbly wiggly triangles in. This is, of course, a very precise triangle normally, but I haven't measured this with my own eyes, so this is maybe the best I can do here to be not wrongly precisely. Okay, I wanted to talk about sRgb, Adobe Rgb and ProPhoto. And the smallest triangle here, that is sRgb. And what I was able to read in many sources was that sRgb, the standard RGB, was to try to unify something. So every device that doesn't want really to work with anything else, point and shoot cameras, for example, should work in sRgb. And so there is not so much to color manage. It produces directly for sRgb. Of course, there's a translation. The sensor by itself is not sRgb. The sensor creates maybe something else, bigger. And so each camera has its own little recipe to finally prove this sRgb, and normally we can switch in a little bit more expensive cameras at least between sRgb and Adobe Rgb. Adobe Rgb is something that is very well known in the photography world at least, and is already a bigger space, so you get all these colors here that you normally couldn't see here. At least I can't on my screen. My screen here on that laptop is a little bit larger than the sRgb, and the Adobe Rgb is larger, so it can transport values and can differentiate between colors that my screen here can't. But sometimes it's important, because in the moment we don't have these differentiation, we have to place all these colors here. But for the rendering in Cinema 4D, we want to have, of course, a wider variety, because after the rendering we mix everything with motion blur, with bokeh, or just based on camera settings that we go closer and more far away, so the mixing of pixels becomes differently. And so the result of a pixel that is mixed with this point here and this point here is different than when I say it's maybe to the white point, this point was then placed here, and the mixture is then here in the middle, instead of middle point would be then here. Something like that. So you get already the idea why I talk about this. It's not just use here this small one and be happy, because on the end everyone will see it maybe in sRgb. And sRgb is very close, not exactly, but it's Rec 709, which is the standard for HD. There's a little difference in the curve, and you can read this, of course, in Charles Poynton's book about HD and video. Whatever. ProPhoto is finally the largest space that I would suggest at all to consider. There's something bigger that we have to discuss later on when we talk about ACES, but not in this series here. And you can see here already, this space goes beyond the visibility, because this is the visible spectrum here, this one from here to here, and this curve here around the horseshoe is, of course, everything here that we can see, and inside is then the chromaticity field. So this is outside of our visibility roughly, and we have also to deal here with a little bit there, but for the simplicity of this triangle, so it can capture the most, these 3 points were set. And ProPhoto has, of course, the largest gamut here, or color space, possible. Anyway, every time the biggest is not the best, and we have to discuss this, of course. And so these three needs a comparison, and we need finally to decide which one we want to use along our pipeline, or if we can switch between, that would be then the conversions. And I want to talk about this right now. When we decide in which format we finally want to deliver our images, maybe 8-bit, maybe 16 or 32-bit float, then we have to make also some decisions about the color space, because when we use, for example, ProPhoto and 8-bit in our image, then we have perhaps some banding issues. That's roughly the standard rule that I could find in every resource. And we don't want to have sRgb maybe just in linear when we have all the color fidelity here. And there's, of course, Adobe Rgb, which is exactly between. that is maybe to consider. So when we have a small one, we clip maybe color values that we had before in our capture device. This is maybe not something that we want to have, and clipping means always that a variety of values finally lands on top of each other. It's not so that they are then differentiable after they were clipped. It's like with when we have here our little diagram and we have a value that goes maybe then here far beyond 1.0, and this point here, this little bit, is then clipped. This is all 1 for this output here. This point here is just 1, and this area here is then lost. We have in video the super wides, then it is not lost, I know, but normally in the moment it's clipped, and then we can't save it anymore. And this is pretty much the case here. So we have to make a decision how much space we need, which is maybe not just a small discussion which one to use, but the simple rule of thumb is if we have a color space that is too large for our image, then we get banding in our colors. When it is too small, we get clipping. And so more than often the middle value here is maybe the right way to go for the stuff that we want to do in terms of textures, because we want to deliver something that reproduces finally the real world, and it mustn't be always that we can reproduce these values later on, because it gets maybe changed based on different lighting techniques, maybe changed on bump maps where we integrate then little shadows on the surface, or it gets even mixed with specular highlights. There's a lot of stuff going on, and sorry for the word stuff, that's not very precise, but there's a lot going on a surface and even reflections and so on that we have to consider. Is it really needed? Is it wanted? Is it bothering us? Is it limiting our quality when we use maybe Adobe Rgb? I wouldn't say Adobe Rgb is normally the best way, but wait a moment, where we get this. So when we start again with the camera here and we can't set it up, then we start with Srgb, and then perhaps we should stay then with our color profile with Srgb and give that then to Cinema 4D, because that makes the most sense. Each conversation has of course a loss. Maybe not when we are in 32-bit float, my preferred way of dealing with things. Gives me ease of mind, not so much in my pocket for the hard drives. I know that theme, but I think things get better with hard drives, and after a while I'm happy that I have the better quality. I can downsample all the time, but upsampling, not so much. So it's a question what you get out of the camera. If you can have Adobe Rgb, then try to go all the way with Adobe Rgb, because in the moment we do not change this, then we have no problems. So how can we change this finally? This is the theme for the next little part in this episode. And what I want to do here with these huge texts is to just check out which one is not available for our use, and so we can maybe eliminate one or two, and then we have only a decision to make between two of them. That's the plan here. Of course, I'm prepared. So the first one, absolute colorimetric. That sounds exactly what we want to have. And is it so? I don't think so. It's a wonderful thing to check out which papers we want to use. So we leave the colors pretty much where they are and we print on different papers. That sounds very clever, but you can see here is the word clipped. That is a big no-no. And this has of course to do only when the gamut, and this is the area inside of our triangles, when the gamut is not there. For maybe we go from a large triangle to a smaller, then all these values that are outside, they become just clipped. That means they land here on this edge, and so far I know the white point here, the gray axis that we have discussed, is normally the direction where they move. That is my fantasy how it works. I couldn't find any other information about this. So they touch here the border and then they stick there. And everything else, which is then identical, stays exactly there. So that sounds not very clever in my book. And that sounds only very valuable when you have maybe logos here in the middle that you want to have exactly as they are. And everything else is maybe not so important. But it's maybe not funny when this logo from the company hits that border. Then better not to convert at all. But sometimes it's needed. So clipping is something that I would not suggest. So no scaling of the colors inside of that, as said, and it's suitable for proving to simulate the output of particular devices. Okay, we don't have that. We want to go to Cinema 4D. That's one device, and this is a device that can really take in a lot of quality in terms of color space. So this one here, not so much for us. Then we go to saturation. That sounds maybe a good idea. And it tries to produce vivid colors. Wait a moment, it tries? That's the first point where I say, ooh, there's something that doesn't really work. And vivid colors, everything seems here a little bit, But out of gamut colors are shifted to the closest reproducible color in the destination. That sounds okay. But everything else is a little bit more for posters. When I read this here correctly, business graphics, graphs, and so on. So when you have a brush and you punch in the brush into the paint can, that's pretty much what this is for. And I simplify here. Make your tests, of course. Do not exclude everything because I say so. You have to find it out. But I want to give you here my input. So saturation, it sounds not really the way it should be. We left with two, and these are two candidates that are pretty close together. But let's go first to Perceptual. And Perceptual is more that it looks for us that there was no change after we have converted from one space into the next. And it takes any color into the next color space, even if it is smaller. And that is, of course, a great idea when we use it for photographic images. And I have made here the differentiation between art and that we need information. And in textures, for me at that moment, just information, not art. We make then art out of it when we work in Cinema 4D with textures. But before, just to reproduce something is maybe a longer discussion. Anyway, I don't try here to be too politically correct, but let's try it in that way. Photographic images, for that, certainly very nice, and it goes here with a lot of out of gamma colors to work. That's very nice, but it is a human-based thingy. That means we go with what we see, what we perceive, and we know we are adaptive. And especially with colors, there is, of course, always, and you remember this maybe from school, when you have a green and a red card, and then there is a gray point in the middle. And when you look to the red one, the point in the middle looks after a while a little bit green, and the red one looks after a little while in the middle a little bit in the opposite way. And that is, of course, everything that we perceive. Our eyes are easily trickable, to say the least. So this one here is nice, but it has some concerns. But it's, of course, from my point of view, better than saturation or absolute colorimetric. The relative colorimetric sounds the best to me. And I say this, of course, based on my knowledge that Cinema 4D is used all over in the world, first. Then, secondly, in all kinds of works. That means visualization for architecture, for medical, for TV, for MoGraph, for film, for visual effects, and so on. The list is endless. Whatever you can see in the world can be done in Cinema 4D or simulated. And so whatever works for you best is, of course, what you find. And that is my tip. I would go, of course, with all four, with maybe 3 or 4 extreme images, textures that you have, and see what happens if you really need to convert them. My favorite things are, of course, relative colorimetric. It doesn't take anything away, the most colors stay, but that means it compresses maybe a little bit of some images, some gamut colors. So I take here again a triangle and another triangle. When it says it preserves more original colors than perceptual, that means everything that is inside the gamut stays where it is, and everything else get then compressed to the sides, to the borders. There's a little bit differentiation. It's like rolled out highlights. I simplify here just to give you an idea. The perceptual takes one color space in, and that's the worst case here, of course, the smaller one, and it takes maybe here the white point in the middle, and it scales it pretty much down based on what scientists have found is the closest and the best for the human eye. Again, I'm not here to say use this or use that. I want to give you only an idea where to go, which direction each one takes, and which direction you finally go is up to you. Make your test, make your own perception, and then you decide. So let's do something practical with it. What I want to do here is to show you what changes finally, and as we have learned, the profile is always the same when we talk about, for example, Srgb. This is something that is a fixed currency exchange rate. And the pixels here in the image has to change because the output is then always the same, should be the same. And so the pixels have to change the value to finally give information into the system that the profile then finally transfers to maybe this screen here, or to the texture, or wherever. And that is what I want to show you here. The long line here is the gray value, and then all these little guys here is everything color. And I will change this here, and then I go back and forth. And what I do here now is to go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. This is something that I wouldn't suggest at all. Do it once, and when it doesn't work, go normally back. Don't make a chain of changes, because you lose each time something in terms of quality. And this brings me to a theme that I haven't mentioned so far. When you go from a large gamut, from a large triangle in this case always, in these 3 color profiles, to a smaller, and you save this file, and you go then later back and put it back into the larger one, you will lose information. And even if you just convert this here and then back, there's of course a loss. We will see what we get here when we go to edit, to convert to profile. And then from Adobe Rgb in 16-bit, that's the minimum what I would suggest to do those things. And then I stay here first in Perceptual, and relative would be then my next candidate. We can go to saturation, which would go here for this middle fields, of course, very nicely, and then we can go to absolute. And let's start with perceptual. And please read about this if you really want to go deep into this. Okay. Have an eye on the pixels here. They change. I go now back and forth so you can take a look how the color changes even in the image. And this screen here has a little bit more gamut than Srgb, and so it can show, of course, a change. I don't know how much is left from this after the compression. So this is now converted one time. It has already a quality loss, which we might not see here, because these colors here are pretty simple, finally. And I go here back to my convert to profile. And this time I go maybe to ProPhoto, and I use something completely different here, maybe saturation, or as I said, relative. Okay, before I start, one little thing. I haven't found anything that speaks against use black point compensation, and you might read as well in the manual, because if I go now here and do the same like for the intent, then we have maybe 1 hour for the whole session here. So from sRgb to ProPhoto, and click OK, and we get here something completely different. So let's have a look here, from here to here. And there's also a little jump in the colors. I hope you can see that. And when I go here back and do this, so I do now here 2 conversations at once, you see the information of each pixel changes here. Each RGB value is finely affected to produce on the end the same picture, or the intent to have the same picture on the screen. Let's go back again, convert to profile, and this time let's say we go back to Adobe Rgb, and we use this time something completely different, and again we get a different way here of pixel variations here. And can you see how the gray point here moves? Not so much here, it jumps really. The gray is completely off, and that is of course something to think about. And when you go with something like that into the game, what I would avoid at any cost is, when you stay here, for example at the moment in Adobe Rgb, and I go here back, to do something like this, assign profile, and don't color match at all. You see what happens? That's not okay. Or just to go to profile and choose something here, because then there's no translation. It just say, please give me all these values accordingly to this film profile here from film footage, and that goes completely wrong. It might look here pretty cool, but it's really hard at all. So this is something when you have no profile at all, because it is not mandatory that images comes always with a profile, and then you have to check out which profile could it be. And I had more than often that I got images back from Photomatix, for example, where I had images that used ProPhoto, for example, and I got not ProPhoto back, and then I assigned the profile because I had always a lilac tint in the images, and I said, what is that? I can't really explain what it is. But in the moment I just assigned a profile, so it ignores whatever happens before and then uses this, and all was fine after that. So I switch this off, and you see here the huge change. Another thing is, of course, when you use, for example, something that works not in the standard agreement. And the standard agreement is that when we have here, and I go here to that gray value with our eyedropper, that we have here all values the same. You see here it works. When I go here, everything is the same, and when RGB values are the same, they should look like gray values or extreme black or white. And this is a common thing for sRgb, for ProPhoto, and for Adobe Rgb. But have a look what happens when I go here just for a moment, convert to profile. So I do it really colorimetric, and of course to go twice into something makes it a little bit weird. I go into DCI, when I can find it here, DCI P3 RGB Gamma 2.6. This is the color space that is normally used for digital cinema, so a very common color space. But now look what happens when I go to the gray value here. I get different values for each channel here. For R, G and B, a different value. And if I go now and apply or assign just a color profile to this without acknowledging that I need to do something completely different here, I would run into problems. So never assign something like that when you really want to convert something. Sorry for the something, it's of course a placeholder for whatever you have in mind to do. So it's really a tough thing to get from one to the next space. If it can be avoided, then please do it. If you can have a color management that goes from the capture device, then after calibrating directly into one color space, and you can stay as long as possible until you reach Cinema 4D in that color space. That is then of course preferable. From there, after rendering, the world is completely set on start. You can go then into a different one. That is maybe not so much the loss as we have seen it here, because we render in 32-bit in Cinema 4D. And with all the movement, motion blur, bokeh and light, and so, as I said it before, we get of course a huge mixture of all of these values, and that is then a complete new image. And internally, as I said, 32-bit, so we can derive from there in a nice way. But not if you render out in 8-bit. Then you have decided already a little bit what you want to do. I think that point is already clear. So what I want to do here is of course to give you just a little icing on top of that. Compact view, and then we go back to our normal view here. I'm a little bit over the top here already with the time, but it's a lean back and watch tutorial. It's not that you have to work with me here and do things, so that is why I take a little bit longer time. Normally the agreement is to have shorter ones. So the idea here is of course to clear something, and that is the color lookup table, or LUT also in slang. And what it does is something completely different than profiles, and the idea is of course not to mix and match these ideas. Profiles are inside of the management of the colors to balance out the characteristic or synchronize characteristica of different input and output devices. And so we get a certainty into our color. And when we work finally with these images, we want to work in something that is maybe combined with a target, a look and feel of a movie or something like that. And for that we have color lookup tables, and this is something that is, for example, already used on set when the camera gives to the video village an image that is of course not corrected, looks more like a Cineon file, very flat, and most people get scared what is going on there. Then a LUT is applied to it, and this gives me here, for example, a film stock, and then I get something like this here. And you have seen all these pixels here move, and you will say, wait a moment, it changes here, but it doesn't change the picture. You see here the 50% gray is exactly where it was, and the next test would be here. I can even go here a little bit inside of that, and I get back to normal. So the color by itself is not touched, and I would sometimes even think I would love to set this here to color to really not touch any luminance things. But this could be of course part of the LUT, so have an eye on that, the intent of that, and maybe normal is the normal use. Anyway, you can create LUTs in many applications like Nuke, and so it's not that difficult to do, but it's not that simple to find finally the right mixture in terms of 32-bit, linear, gamma, and so on. And it helps of course to finally get in every work that you do directly the look and feel. For example, Digital Mud Painter. They want to have maybe exactly what the movie is all about on the end, but this can change on the end. And so you normally work as you think it's more natural or your intent already, and then you take a look how the movie would apply a color correction, a color grading to it. Just to clear this term, LUTs are on top, profiles are inside of the color management and help you to get the pictures in the best way as you have intended it in the first place. Thanks for listening, and I know it was a long one, so really thank you. Have fun with it. Bye bye.